So I think what's maybe useful is to kind of, instead of just picking one thing and digging down into all the detail, kind of going through it in layers. So starting at the highest level and then sort of going one level down with each of the different types of recommenders. And Jay's spoken about a lot of them, but we can just go, and Jay, if you have anything to contribute while I'm going through it, please go ahead. So I think the one kind of basic type of offer recommender that people often implement is something that is just based on historical data and uses a single model to recommend one of multiple options. So whether that's menu items or an offer to make to people or design construct or whatever it is, you basically take one big data set, build one big model, and you'll train your model on your one big data set and deploy that. And there's often kind of additional functionality you need to build around that to make it useful. If you want to rank things by some sort of profitability metric or a range of things like that. But at the core of the recommender piece, that's the way that one of them can work. The second one, which I think is often more effective, and Jay was mentioning it earlier, is instead of building one model for everything, you build a separate model for each option that you're looking to recommend. So if we're talking about offers to make to people, you might be giving either 10% off or a month free or something else. You would build 3 different models, one for each of those instead of one model for all 3. That allows you more flexibility in how you structure your data sets and how you put things together, and can often give more effective results than the single model approach. I mean, when Jay was talking about having the technology to enable you to try different things, I think one of the reasons people often don't do this is, I was talking about 3 options and that sounds fine, but generally there's far more than that. So if you have even sort of 10, 20, up to hundreds of different things that you're choosing between, one, how do you actually sort of train all of those models? But more importantly, how do you implementing one model in production is hard enough. Like, how do you implement hundreds of them in a way that still performs at a high speed and is reliable and all of those sort of things? The next piece is, what if you don't have that kind of historical data set, or you have a much more limited historical data set? So that's kind of more of the cold start problem. And, how do you have a recommender that has more of a experiment ideology or approach to it? So you're not saying we're just going to take this historical data and based on what it tells us, we're going to make recommendations. Like, how do you set things up so that it will learn from your customer interactions and use information that you have available, but mainly base its recommendations on how people are actually behaving now?
So Eric?
Yeah, go ahead.
I can just give some context. For those who are from kind of the marketing theory space, if you look at Ansar's model around how you address markets, and you had to think of, on the one end, how you're going to address your market, the other end, the kind of product that you use, and you've got existing market, existing product. Your style of configuring that would be that you understand based on your priors how people have engaged, and you could probably get away with using fairly traditional recommender systems. But as soon as you get into the new space, and let's say that you got a new product in an existing market, you don't have priors, but you have an understanding as to how the customer has behaved historically. So the customer probably becomes the driver in the context of the launch, because you want to be able to understand what are the novelty-based drivers, what are the interests of the customers that have responded to new recommendations rather than ones that are available to them currently. So if you want to launch a new product, but if you go into a new market with an existing product, you probably will take your historical behavior of how you've launched products, what has happened in the context of that particular launch, and you'll have a slightly different dimension. So the idea is that when you set up experiments, you can decide if you want to use any price or some price, the way that Eric described it now. So you can use, if it fits within your Ansoff strategy, you can then see, well, if it is something that is new market, new product, as you know, very difficult. You sit with a cold start problem unless your product is homogeneous and you're very narrowly focused on a certain market or a certain channel. So this gives you an opportunity to configure experiments to deal with anything that is away from what you normally used to do or what the norm was of your historical based interactions. It allows you some way to do that. So you can do it within, a multitude of those configurations. Eric, I just thought it would be context.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. The other thing that it helps you with as well is if your environment is changing over, which can often be the case. So whether that's through seasonality or just sort of shifts in behavior through kind of events like, COVID or Ukraine, or even smaller things like, load shedding, or it gets cold, or whatever it is, human behavior is impacted by the environment. So using something that leans more heavily on how people interacting with it now rather than your historical data set can be more effective in that case. The next couple are kind of in a sort of follow that experimentation framework, but more based on kind of, changing the interface and how you would interact with people. So, what messages would you send to someone? Look, even if you know what you want to say, like, how would you say it? Because that can have a big impact on how people behave. The next piece that's kind of something useful to think about in terms of like how you want to do your recommender, which Jay also mentioned, is, we were talking here, the offer recommender multi-model, about having a model per option. You can actually go down to the space of having a model per customer. So whether that's in the experiment or the more experimental sort of framework or the more historical model-based framework, it can be quite an effective approach to have a model per customer, particularly if, the main requirement is you need to have fairly regular interactions with those customers. And this is one of those things where it's useful to, again, think about the fact that, you can kind of combine all of these approaches. So, you could use your model per customer for people who interact with you regularly, and use a broader model for people who come in once in a while. But that model per customer, because you are learning specifically based on someone's interactions and preferences, as long as you have enough data from them, there's less noise from the rest of the environment. You don't have to be like, other people who had this characteristic, effectively other people who had this characteristic also behaved this way. Get a bit, how did this person behave? So that can be quite effective. So the other, talking about, combining in that case of, maybe you have a customer level model and a more general model, you can also think about combining the like historical database approach with the more experimental approach. So the most basic form of that is you basically set aside a proportion of your interactions and say those are going to be at random. And you use that to make sure that you're still kind of exploring the environment and seeing what's going on. And so say you do 10% random and 90% based on the model. And then, you can move up to doing more sophisticated approaches based on, kind of looking at how uncertain you are about different options or places, like areas in the environment that you're working in, and maybe focusing on places with higher uncertainty while also using kind of more of a model-based approach to see what could be the best recommendation to make to a specific person.